The Morgan family home in rural Massachusetts stood dignified against the November chill, its colonial architecture adorned with tasteful Thanksgiving decorations. Golden light spilled from windows onto the frost-tipped lawn as vehicles lined the circular driveway. Luxury sedans and SUVs bearing the family members who gathered only twice yearly for obligation-driven holiday meals. Emma Morgan, 32 and visibly tense, sat in her modest Honda at the end of the driveway, gripping the steering wheel though the engine had been off for several minutes. She studied her reflection in the rearview mirror, tucking a strand of chestnut hair behind her ear, rehearsing the pleasant but detached expressions she'd perfected over years of family gatherings. Next to her on the passenger seat sat a homemade cranberry cake, her contribution to the meal that would inevitably be relegated to the far end of the dessert table, overshadowed by her cousin Abigail's professional-looking pies and her sister-in-law's trendy confections. Emma's offerings, like Emma herself, were perpetually positioned at the periphery of Morgan family celebrations. The tap on her window startled her. Her brother Michael stood there, collar turned up against the cold, breath fogging in the November air. "Planning to spend Thanksgiving in the car?" he asked as she rolled down the window. His tone carried the familiar mix of affection and gentle mockery that characterized their relationship. "Just gathering strength," Emma replied with a half-smile. "How bad is it in there?" "Dad's talking politics with Uncle Robert. Mom's criticizing the caterers, and Grandmother Morgan is asking everyone when they're going to produce more heirs to the family name. So, standard operating procedure." Emma sighed, reaching for her cake. "At least Aunt Judith will be there. Is she here yet?" Something flickered across Michael's face, an expression Emma couldn't quite read. "She arrived about an hour ago. Seems different somehow." "Different how?" Michael shrugged. "Just purposeful. You know how she gets when she's made up her mind about something." Emma nodded. Aunt Judith, her father's younger sister and the family's beautiful black sheep, had always moved to her own rhythm, choosing art over the family investment business, travel over stability, authentic relationships over socially advantageous ones. For as long as Emma could remember, Judith had been her quiet ally in family gatherings, offering subtle winks of solidarity when Emma's achievements went unacknowledged or her opinions dismissed. "Well," Emma said, opening her car door, "let's not keep the Morgan dynasty waiting." As they walked toward the imposing front door, Emma straightened her shoulders, preparing to take her usual position at the margins of the family she'd never quite fit into, unaware that this particular Thanksgiving would upend 2 decades of carefully maintained family dynamics. The Morgan family home's grand foyer welcomed Emma with familiar sensory impressions: the scent of beeswax polish and autumn floral arrangements, the gentle ticking of the antique grandfather clock, the murmur of practiced social conversation from the adjoining rooms. She handed her coat to Harriet, the housekeeper who had served the family for 30 years and who offered Emma a genuine smile of welcome. "Good to see you, Miss Emma. It's been too long." "Thanks, Harriet. How have you been?" Their brief exchange was interrupted by Emma's mother, Victoria Morgan, who appeared in the archway with perfect posture and a measured smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Emma, darling, you finally arrived. Everyone's already here." The gentle criticism in her tone, "You're late, as usual," was delivered with such practiced subtlety that objecting would seem oversensitive. "Traffic from Boston was heavy," Emma replied, the explanation both true and irrelevant. In the Morgan family, reasons were considered excuses, and excuses were considered weaknesses. "Your cake looks homey," Victoria observed, glancing at Emma's offering. "I'll have Harriet place it in the kitchen. We've hired Bellingham's for dessert this year. They've prepared the most extraordinary pumpkin soufflés." Before Emma could respond, her mother had turned to address Michael, her voice warming noticeably. "Michael, your father's looking for you. Something about the Matthews acquisition." As Victoria swept away with Emma's cake, Michael squeezed his sister's shoulder. "And so it begins," he murmured. "I'll find you later." Emma moved through the formal living room, navigating the carefully coordinated social clusters of extended family. She offered polite greetings to cousins who responded with the peculiar Morgan family blend of cordiality and assessment. Her brother Andrew's wife Jennifer showcased photos of their toddler son on her phone to admiring relatives, while Emma's father, Richard, held court near the fireplace, discussing market projections with his brothers. No one asked about Emma's recent promotion at the environmental nonprofit where she worked, a position that baffled her family, both for its modest salary and its focus on conservation rather than consumption. The Morgans were builders, developers, expanders. Emma's desire to protect rather than exploit natural resources was viewed as a curious, possibly temporary aberration. "There's my favorite niece," came a warm voice from the doorway to the sunroom. Aunt Judith stood there, elegant as always in a jewel-toned silk tunic over black pants, her silver-streaked hair cut in a stylish bob that defied her 62 years. Emma moved toward her aunt with genuine pleasure, accepting her embrace and the scent of the distinctive sandalwood perfume Judith had brought back from her travels in India decades ago. "You look wonderful," Emma said, meaning it. There was something different about her aunt today, a clarity in her gaze, a deliberate quality to her movements that suggested more than her usual self-possession. "As do you," Judith replied, studying Emma with unusual intensity. "Boston clearly agrees with you. Tell me about this river restoration project you've been working on." They settled on a window seat slightly removed from the main gathering, and Emma found herself describing her work with unexpected animation. The coalition building with community groups, the challenging negotiations with industrial stakeholders, the preliminary results showing improved water quality. "It matters," Emma concluded. "It's not glamorous or particularly profitable, but it matters." Judith nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You've always seen value where others in this family see only price tags. That's a rare gift, Emma." Before Emma could respond, the crystal chime that signaled dinner rang through the rooms. As family members began migrating toward the formal dining room, Judith placed a hand on Emma's arm. "Before we join the performance in there," she said quietly, "I need you to know something. I've made some decisions recently that will likely cause a stir today. Just remember that appearances in this family rarely reflect reality." Puzzled, Emma followed her aunt into the dining room, where place cards positioned each family member according to Victoria's careful social engineering. As she had anticipated, Emma found her name at the far corner of the table, the traditional location for unmarried, childless family members of limited social utility. She took her seat beside a second cousin's teenage son, who immediately became absorbed in his phone beneath the table. From her peripheral position, Emma could observe the entire gathering. 24 Morgans and Morgan adjacents arranged around the massive mahogany table that had witnessed decades of family politics and power dynamics. At the head sat her grandmother, Eleanor Morgan, now 87, but still sharp-eyed and imperious. At the opposite end was Emma's father, Richard, who had assumed the mantle of family patriarch in practical matters while deferring symbolically to his mother. Victoria presided from Richard's right, while the remaining seats were allocated in concentric circles of decreasing importance radiating outward from these power centers. Aunt Judith, Emma noticed with surprise, had been seated unusually close to the head of the table, between grandmother Morgan and Emma's successful older brother Andrew. This placement represented a noticeable shift from Judith's typically marginal position, a change that didn't escape the notice of other family members, who exchanged subtle glances. As the first course was served, butternut squash soup garnished with crisped sage leaves, Richard Morgan rose to deliver his traditional Thanksgiving address. Emma had heard variations of this speech throughout her life, its core always the same: gratitude for the family's continued prosperity, acknowledgement of business triumphs, and oblique references to disappointments reframed as areas of ongoing development. "The Morgan legacy continues to strengthen," Richard concluded, raising his wine glass, "through adherence to the principles that have guided this family for generations: strategic vision, unwavering determination, and the pursuit of excellence in all endeavors." The family raised their glasses in practiced unison, a choreography of belonging that Emma participated in while feeling, as always, slightly out of step. As she sipped her wine, her gaze met Aunt Judith's across the table. Her aunt's expression held something unexpected, a hint of anticipation, perhaps even mischief, that seemed out of place amid the orchestrated solemnity of a Morgan family dinner. Emma couldn't have known then that by dessert, everything she understood about her place in the family constellation would be irrevocably altered. The main course arrived with the precision of a military operation, servers presenting platters of heritage turkey, traditional stuffing, and seasonal vegetables simultaneously around the table. Victoria Morgan supervised the service with subtle gestures and meaningful glances, a general deploying troops with maximum efficiency. Conversation during Morgan family meals followed unwritten but rigid protocols. Business topics dominated the primary discussion near the table's power center, with Richard, his brothers, and the professionally successful cousins exchanging insights on market trends and investment opportunities. A secondary conversation among the women typically focused on children's achievements, charitable committee work, and tastefully edited family news. From her corner position, Emma observed rather than participated, offering appropriate responses when directly addressed, but otherwise remaining in the background, a role she had perfected since adolescence. She watched Michael navigate between worlds, contributing to business discussions while occasionally sending her sympathetic glances. "I understand congratulations are in order, Emma," said her Uncle Robert suddenly, addressing her from several seats away. "Victoria mentioned you've taken a new position?" All eyes turned toward Emma, creating one of those uncomfortable moments when the family's attention felt more like scrutiny than interest. "Yes," Emma replied, straightening slightly. "I'm now directing our watershed restoration program. We're working to rehabilitate the Merrimack River Basin, partnering with both conservation groups and industries along the river." "Admirable," Robert nodded, his tone suggesting the opposite. "Though I imagine the compensation is modest?" "The work is rewarding," Emma answered diplomatically. "Emma has always valued purpose over profit," interjected Aunt Judith, her voice carrying clearly across the table. A perspective this family could benefit from adopting more widely. A brief, uncomfortable silence followed. Judith rarely challenged family values so directly during formal gatherings, preferring instead to deploy subtle irony that went unnoticed by most. "Different priorities for different generations, I suppose," Victoria offered smoothly, steering the conversation back to safer waters. "Andrew, tell everyone about Harrison's new preschool. It's quite revolutionary in its approach." As Andrew launched into a detailed explanation of his son's expensive educational advantages, Emma felt Judith's gaze lingering on her. When she glanced at her aunt, Judith offered a barely perceptible wink before turning her attention to Grandmother Morgan. Leaning close to speak quietly in the elderly woman's ear, Emma noticed her grandmother's expression shift from polite attention to focused interest as she listened to whatever Judith was saying. Eleanor Morgan nodded once, decisively, before returning to her meal with renewed purpose. The mysterious exchange made Emma curious, but before she could ponder it further, her cousin Abigail's husband David engaged her in conversation about Boston's cultural scene, a safe topic that carried them through the remainder of the main course. As dishes were being cleared for dessert, Emma's father tapped his water glass gently, drawing the table's attention. "Before we move to coffee and dessert in the living room, Mother has asked to say a few words." This departure from tradition caused a ripple of surprise. Grandmother Morgan rarely spoke at length during family gatherings anymore, preferring to observe and occasionally deliver cutting observations when least expected. Eleanor Morgan straightened in her chair, her posture impeccable despite her years. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority that had guided the family through both prosperity and challenges. "For 87 Thanksgivings, I have witnessed this family's evolution," she began. "Today, I find myself reflecting on what truly constitutes the Morgan legacy." She paused, her gaze traveling deliberately around the table. "Richard speaks of strategic vision and pursuit of excellence. These are indeed Morgan values. But there is another quality that defined my late husband's approach to both business and family: integrity in the face of pressure to compromise." Another pause, longer this time. Emma noticed several family members shifting uncomfortably in their seats. "Recent events have caused me to reevaluate certain family decisions," Eleanor continued. "Judith has brought to my attention matters that require correction. Before we proceed with those discussions, however, I wish to acknowledge someone whose quiet integrity has gone unrecognized for too long." Eleanor's gaze found Emma in her corner position. "My granddaughter Emma has chosen a path that prioritizes stewardship over acquisition, a choice this family has not adequately respected. Yet her work embodies principles that Joseph Morgan himself would have recognized as essential to meaningful success." Emma felt heat rising to her cheeks as the entire family turned to look at her. This unprecedented recognition from her grandmother left her momentarily speechless. "Furthermore," Eleanor continued, "Emma's recent professional advancement deserves acknowledgement equal to any merger or acquisition this family has celebrated. She has achieved this success entirely on her merit, without leveraging the Morgan name or connections." Victoria looked as though she had bitten into something sour, while Richard's expression revealed genuine surprise. Michael was grinning openly, clearly enjoying the unexpected turn of events. "Judith," Eleanor said, turning to her daughter-in-law, "I believe you wish to offer a toast?" Aunt Judith rose gracefully, lifting her wine glass. Though she stood near the head of the table, her gaze traveled directly to Emma in her corner seat. "To Emma," Judith said clearly, her voice carrying genuine pride, whose quiet courage in forging her own path reminds us that the most valuable legacy isn't measured in dollars or status, but in positive impact on the world around us. One by one, family members raised their glasses, some enthusiastically, others with visible reluctance. As Emma accepted this unprecedented recognition, she noticed something else in Judith's expression, a hint of anticipation, suggesting that this toast was merely prelude to something more significant yet to come. The transition to coffee and dessert in the living room carried an undercurrent of tension following Grandmother Morgan's unexpected remarks. Family members clustered in smaller groups, conversations hushed and speculative. Emma found herself approached by relatives who had barely acknowledged her existence at previous gatherings, their sudden interest transparent and slightly uncomfortable. "Your environmental work sounds fascinating," said her cousin Abigail, who had previously dismissed Emma's career as glorified volunteering. "Perhaps you could speak at Harrison's school about conservation," suggested Andrew's wife Jennifer, who had never before sought Emma's input on anything. Emma navigated these interactions with polite detachment, aware that the family's attention stemmed not from genuine interest in her work, but from Grandmother Morgan's unexpected endorsement. Power recognized power in the Morgan family, and Eleanor's public approval had momentarily elevated Emma's status in the carefully calibrated family hierarchy. She was contemplating a strategic retreat to help Harriet in the kitchen when Michael appeared at her elbow, balancing 2 plates of dessert. "I rescued your cranberry cake," he said, offering her a generous slice. It was actually getting more attention than the fancy soufflés. Mom looks positively disturbed by this development. Emma accepted the plate with a grateful smile. "What do you make of Grandmother's speech and Aunt Judith's toast?" Michael glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. "Something's happening." Dad was completely blindsided. I could tell by the way he was clenching his jaw. "And have you noticed Judith's been having private conversations with Grandmother all afternoon?" Before Emma could respond, the gentle chime of silver against crystal cut through the room's conversations. All eyes turned to find Aunt Judith standing beside Grandmother Morgan near the fireplace, the family patriarch seated regally in her favorite wingback chair. "If I could have everyone's attention," Judith announced, her voice calm but commanding. "Eleanor and I have some matters to discuss with the family." The room quieted immediately. Richard Morgan moved to stand near his mother, his expression a careful mask that didn't quite hide his concern. "Mother, perhaps this could wait for a more private—" "No, Richard," Eleanor interrupted firmly. "Thanksgiving has always been when this family addresses important matters. Today will be no exception." Richard stepped back, yielding to his mother's authority, though tension radiated from his posture. Victoria moved to stand beside him, a united front against whatever might be coming. "As some of you know," Judith began, "I've spent the past year researching the family history for a memoir I'm writing." This was news to Emma, and judging by the surprised expressions around the room, to most of the family as well. "During this process, I discovered documents in Joseph Morgan's personal archives that shed new light on the founding of Morgan Investments in 1938. Judith paused, her gaze sweeping the room. Specifically, letters between Joseph and his original business partner, a man named Edward Harrington. At the mention of this name, Emma noticed her father and uncles exchange sharp glances. Even more telling was Grandmother Eleanor's expression, a combination of resignation and determination. "For those unfamiliar with the name," Judith continued, "Edward Harrington has been completely erased from our family's official history. Yet these letters confirm he provided half the initial capital for what became Morgan Investments. More significantly, he developed the investment strategy that produced the company's first major successes." The room had gone completely still, family members frozen in various states of confusion or dawning comprehension. "When I asked Mother about these letters," Judith said, nodding toward Eleanor, "she confirmed what they suggested, that in 1942, Joseph Morgan forced Edward Harrington out of the company, leveraging wartime anti-Semitism to challenge his partner's reputation with their clients and eventually acquiring his ownership share for a fraction of its value." A collective intake of breath swept through the room. This version of family history contradicted everything the younger generations had been raised to believe about their revered grandfather Joseph, the self-made financial genius whose integrity and vision had established the Morgan fortune. "That's a serious accusation," Richard said tightly, "and one that cannot be substantiated now that all parties involved are deceased." "Actually," Eleanor Morgan said, speaking for the first time since Judith began, "I am very much alive, Richard. And as one of the parties involved, I can indeed substantiate these events." She straightened in her chair, every inch the family matriarch despite the bomb she was detonating in their carefully constructed family narrative. "I was married to Joseph when he orchestrated Edward's removal. I witnessed his actions, his justifications, and later, his regrets. Eleanor's voice remained steady. Joseph convinced himself it was necessary for the company's survival during uncertain times. He intended to make amends after the war, but success made that increasingly difficult to contemplate. Victoria stepped forward, her social poise visibly strained. Eleanor, surely this ancient history need not concern the younger generations. Whatever business disagreements occurred. This was not a business disagreement, Victoria, Eleanor interrupted sharply. It was theft, enabled by prejudice. Joseph took advantage of wartime suspicion toward Jewish Americans to dismantle a partnership that had been both profitable and equitable. Emma watched her father's face as this unvarnished assessment of his revered father registered. Richard Morgan looked physically pained, as though the foundation beneath his feet was crumbling. Why now? Andrew asked, breaking the stunned silence. Why reveal this after 80 years? Judith answered, her voice softening slightly. Because Edward Harrington's granddaughter deserves to know her family's true history. Because the Morgan fortune was built partly on a grave injustice that has never been acknowledged, let alone rectified. And who exactly is this granddaughter? Richard demanded, though something in his expression suggested he already feared the answer. Judith turned, her gaze finding Emma in the crowded room. Edward Harrington was my biological father, she said clearly, and Emma's biological grandfather. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock that had witnessed generations of Morgan family secrets. The revelation hung in the air like suspended crystal, catching the light from different angles as each family member processed its implications. Emma felt as though she were watching the scene from outside herself. The shocked faces, her father's pallor, Michael's widening eyes, and most strikingly, Aunt Judith standing tall beside grandmother Eleanor, both women appearing unburdened rather than distressed by the disclosure. Victoria was the first to recover, her social training automatically asserting itself in crisis. Perhaps the younger children should be excused, she suggested, gesturing toward the teenagers who were watching the adult drama with undisguised fascination. No, Eleanor countered firmly. This family has excelled at hiding uncomfortable truths. No more. Everyone stays. Richard had sunk onto the arm of a nearby chair, his composure visibly shaken. Judith, he said, his voice unnaturally controlled. Are you claiming that you are not, that father wasn't? Joseph Morgan was not my biological father, Judith confirmed, though he raised me as his daughter, believing me to be his own. Emma's mind raced to connect pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed until moments ago. But how? I don't understand. Judith turned to Emma with gentle understanding. It's complicated, but you deserve the full truth. She took a breath before continuing. After Joseph forced Edward out of the business, Eleanor maintained a friendship with Edward's wife, Rebecca, a connection she kept secret from her husband. Eleanor nodded, taking up the narrative. Rebecca Harrington was brilliant and kind. While our husbands became enemies, we refused to abandon our friendship. When she discovered she was expecting Edward's child in late 1942, they were already facing financial ruin because of Joseph's actions. The elderly woman's voice remained steady, though her hands trembled slightly. Then tragedy struck. Edward was killed in a car accident in early 1943. Rebecca, widowed and pregnant, feared she couldn't provide for a child alone in such difficult circumstances. Meanwhile, Judith continued, Eleanor had suffered several miscarriages and was told she likely couldn't have more children. Joseph desperately wanted a daughter. Understanding dawned across the room as family members began to comprehend what had happened. You took in Rebecca's baby, Emma said softly. Raised her as your own. As a Morgan, Eleanor confirmed. Rebecca made the heartbreaking choice to give her daughter a life of security and privilege, even if it meant within the family that had destroyed her husband. I promised to love her child as my own, and to someday tell her daughter the truth. But you didn't, Richard interjected, finding his voice. You let father believe Judith was his biological child. You let all of us believe a lie. Yes, Eleanor acknowledged without apology. Joseph's guilt over Edward's fate was already consuming him. I feared what knowing about Judith's true parentage might do, both to him and potentially to her security within the family. I learned the truth only last year, Judith explained, when I found letters in Eleanor's private papers while researching the memoir. Letters from Rebecca Harrington to Eleanor, written over decades, asking about her daughter's welfare. Emma struggled to process the implications. So you're not biologically a Morgan. she said to Judith. "You're a Harrington, which means you are Edward Harrington's great-granddaughter," Judith confirmed gently. "Your connection to the Morgans is through marriage, not blood." The room erupted into multiple conversations, shock and confusion manifesting in raised voices and emphatic gestures. Andrew appeared to be arguing with his wife, while various cousins huddled in concerned clusters. Victoria had moved to Richard's side, her hand on his shoulder in a rare public display of support. Michael made his way to Emma, his expression a mixture of concern and amazement. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. Emma nodded slowly, still processing. "I think so. It's just everything I thought about who I am. You're still you," Michael said firmly. "This doesn't change who you are, just some details about how you got here." Their conversation was interrupted by Richard Morgan, who had risen to his feet, visibly struggling to reassert control over the situation. "Even if what you're saying is true," he addressed Judith and Eleanor, his voice tight, "bringing this up now, in this setting, serves no purpose except to destabilize the family and potentially damage the company's reputation. What exactly do you hope to accomplish?" "Justice," Judith replied simply. "Recognition of Edward Harrington's contribution to what became Morgan Investments. Acknowledgement of the wrong done to him and his family. And reparation," Eleanor added, "the terms of which I have already outlined in legal documents prepared by my attorney." This announcement created another wave of reaction throughout the room. Victoria gasped audibly, while Richard's face flushed with anger. "You've taken legal steps without consulting me?" he demanded. "Without any family discussion?" "Yes," Eleanor confirmed. "The decision was mine to make, as the primary shareholder of Morgan Investments and the last living person with first-hand knowledge of these events." Grandmother Morgan's gaze found Emma across the room, which brings us to why Emma's presence is particularly important today. The reparation plan includes a significant role for Edward Harrington's great-granddaughter, should she choose to accept it. All eyes turned to Emma, who felt suddenly exposed in the corner of the room she'd automatically retreated to, her habitual position at the margins now the center of everyone's attention. "What kind of role?" she asked, her voice steadier than she expected. Eleanor Morgan's expression softened slightly. "One that honors both your heritage and the values you've demonstrated throughout your life. Values that, I suspect, Edward Harrington would have recognized and approved." Aunt Judith moved across the room to stand beside Emma, a clear signal of alliance. "Before you hear the details," she said quietly, "there's more you need to understand about your connection to the Harringtons, and why your environmental work may not be a random career choice after all." Eleanor Morgan signaled to Harriet, who had been hovering discreetly near the doorway throughout the revelations. "Please bring the portfolio from my study," she instructed. As Harriet departed on this errand, Eleanor addressed the still stunned family. "While we wait, I suggest everyone take a moment to compose themselves. This information is undoubtedly shocking, but hysterics will not change the facts." Victoria, ever conscious of appearances, began directing family members back to their seats. "Perhaps some fresh coffee would help," she suggested, her voice artificially bright. "And we haven't properly enjoyed the desserts." The absurdity of returning to social niceties after such revelations might have been amusing if the tension weren't so palpable. Nevertheless, the deeply ingrained Morgan family protocols reasserted themselves as everyone mechanically resumed their seats, though the earlier seating hierarchy had dissolved into disarray. Emma found herself between Michael and Aunt Judith on one of the formal sofas, directly across from her father and mother. Richard's expression remained strained, while Victoria maintained a rigid smile that fooled no one. "You've had a year to process this," Emma said quietly to Judith. "I've had 5 minutes." Judith nodded, understanding in her eyes. "I know this is overwhelming, but there's a reason the truth needed to come out today with everyone present." Harriet returned with a leather portfolio, which she handed to Eleanor before discreetly withdrawing from the room. The elderly matriarch opened it carefully, removing several documents and photographs. "Edward Harrington was more than Joseph Morgan's business partner," Eleanor began, her voice carrying the authority that had commanded respect for decades. "He was a visionary in many ways, including his understanding of environmental stewardship at a time when such concerns were considered irrelevant to business." She passed a yellowed newspaper clipping to Emma. The headline read, "Financier Challenges Industry on River Pollution," accompanied by a photograph of a distinguished-looking man addressing what appeared to be a business association. Edward advocated for sustainable practices decades before they became mainstream concerns, Eleanor continued. He believed financial success carried an obligation to protect natural resources for future generations, a perspective Joseph and other business leaders dismissed as impractical idealism. Emma studied the photograph, searching for resemblances to herself or Judith in the serious face of Edward Harrington. There was something familiar in the set of his jaw, the intensity of his gaze. After Joseph forced Edward out, Judith explained, the environmental initiatives Edward had begun within their company were abandoned. Joseph focused exclusively on financial growth, establishing the Morgan approach to business that continues today. Richard shifted uncomfortably. If you're suggesting that Morgan Investments has been environmentally irresponsible, I'm stating it as fact, Eleanor interrupted. The company's environmental record is abysmal, despite your occasional performative green initiatives for public relations purposes. Victoria gasped at this blunt assessment, while several of the cousins who worked for various Morgan enterprises exchanged uneasy glances. Edward established a separate trust before his death, Eleanor continued, retrieving another document from the portfolio. A modest fund dedicated to environmental conservation, particularly focused on watershed protection in New England. Rebecca managed it after his death, and later their nephew, as the family had no other children. Emma felt a strange resonance at these words. Her own focus on river restoration suddenly seemed less like a random career choice and more like an echo of something deeper, an inherited concern she hadn't known existed. The Harrington Environmental Trust still exists, Judith added. It's small, but has funded significant conservation projects over decades. When I discovered my true parentage, I began researching the Trust's work and found something remarkable. She turned to Emma with a smile that contained both pride and wonder. 3 years ago, the Trust provided seed funding to a river restoration project on the Merrimack, a project spearheaded by an environmental scientist named Emma Morgan, who had no idea she was applying to her great-grandfather's foundation. Emma's breath caught. The anonymous donor, she whispered. The initial funding that had launched her career-defining project had come from a foundation created by her own biological great-grandfather. Some might call it coincidence, Eleanor observed. I prefer to think of it as inheritance of the most meaningful kind. Not money or status, but purpose and values. Richard Morgan had been listening with increasing agitation. This is all very touching, he said, unable to keep the edge from his voice. But it doesn't explain what reparations you've arranged without family consultation, Mother. Eleanor fixed her son with a level gaze. The legal details are complex, but the essence is simple. 30% of Morgan investments will be transferred to a restructured Harrington Environmental Trust. This represents a conservative estimate of Edward's original ownership stake, adjusted for 8 decades of growth. The announcement hit like a thunderclap. Andrew actually choked on his coffee, while Victoria's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. 30%? Richard repeated incredulously. You're giving away nearly a third of the company to a conservation trust? Not giving away, Eleanor corrected. Returning to its rightful co-owner's legacy, with specific conditions regarding its use. She turned to Emma. The restructured trust will require leadership from Edward's descendants. As his only great-grandchild with expertise in environmental science, you are uniquely qualified to help guide the trust's work, Emma, if you choose to accept this responsibility. Emma felt as though the room were tilting slightly. The corner seat she'd occupied at dinner now seemed a distant memory, as did her peripheral status in the family. In the space of an hour, she had discovered a new heritage, a genetic predisposition toward the very work that had called to her, and now was being offered stewardship of resources that could transform environmental conservation throughout New England. And if I decline? She asked, her practical nature asserting itself despite her shock. Then Judith, as Edward's granddaughter, will assume primary responsibility, Eleanor answered. But having observed your work and principles over the years, I believe you are Edward's true heir in spirit as well as blood. Richard Morgan's face had flushed deep red. This is outrageous. The board will never approve such a restructuring. The board won't have a choice, Eleanor replied calmly. As you well know, I still control 52% of voting shares. My decision is final. As the implications of this statement registered across the room, Emma realized that this Thanksgiving had forever altered not just her understanding of her place in the family, but the very foundation of the Morgan dynasty itself. The elegantly appointed living room had transformed into something resembling a corporate crisis center. Richard Morgan was engaged in an intense phone conversation in one corner, presumably with the family's legal team. Victoria had ushered the younger cousins and in-laws to the library, ostensibly for dessert, but clearly to remove them from the epicenter of family upheaval. Andrew and Michael stood near the fireplace in heated discussion, occasionally glancing toward Emma. Eleanor Morgan remained in her wingback chair, seemingly untroubled by the chaos her revelations had sparked. Beside her, Judith sorted through additional documents from the portfolio, occasionally passing items to the family matriarch for her review. Emma sat slightly apart, attempting to process the seismic shifts in her understanding of herself and her family. The cranberry cake Michael had rescued for her sat untouched on a side table, forgotten in the aftermath of revelations. "It's a lot to absorb," came a voice breaking through her thoughts. Emma looked up to find her cousin Abigail standing nearby, 2 fresh cups of coffee in hand. "I thought you might need this." Emma accepted the cup with surprise. Abigail had always been firmly in the inner circle of Morgan family dynamics. Successful, married to an appropriate professional, mother to children enrolled in the right schools. She and Emma had maintained cordial but distant relations throughout adulthood. "Thank you," Emma said simply, making room on the small sofa. Abigail sat, smoothing her skirt with an automatic gesture. "For what it's worth, I think grandmother is right about you being the right person to lead this trust thing. Your environmental work has always been more impressive than most of us acknowledged." The unexpected support momentarily rendered Emma speechless. "Why are you being nice to me?" she finally asked, too emotionally exhausted for pretense. Abigail smiled slightly, a genuine expression rarely seen at family gatherings. "Because this family has been wrong about a lot of things apparently, including you." She paused, then added more quietly, "And because I've always somewhat envied your courage to pursue what matters to you, rather than what the family expected." Before Emma could respond to this surprising confession, Richard Morgan approached, his phone call evidently concluded. His expression was controlled but severe. "Emma, we need to speak privately," he said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. Abigail squeezed Emma's arm briefly before standing. "Remember who you are," she murmured, then moved away, leaving father and daughter alone. Richard took the vacated seat, maintaining a formal distance. "This situation has clearly spiraled out of control," he began, his voice low enough not to carry across the room. "Mother and Judith have orchestrated a narrative designed to appeal to your idealistic tendencies." "You mean they've told me the truth about my heritage?" Emma countered, surprised by her own steadiness. "They've shared one version of events from 80 years ago, with no opportunity for balanced perspective." Richard leaned slightly closer. "Business decisions during wartime were complex, Emma. Joseph Morgan built a financial institution that has supported this family for generations and employed thousands. Whatever occurred with Edward Harrington was undoubtedly more nuanced than Mother's simplified account." Emma studied her father's face, the face she had spent her life trying to please, despite knowing she would never quite measure up to his expectations. "Are you suggesting grandmother is lying?" "I'm suggesting she's 87 years old, with a selective memory influenced by whatever agenda Judith has been advancing this past year." Richard's expression softened slightly, adopting the persuasive manner he used in difficult negotiations. "The point is, any hasty decisions regarding company ownership would be irresponsible. We need time for proper legal review, for family discussion, for consideration of all stakeholders." "You mean time to find a way to block grandmother's plan?" Emma translated. Richard's jaw tightened momentarily before he regained his composure. "Emma, you've always been intelligent. Surely you can see that transferring 30% of a multi-billion-dollar company to an environmental trust is not sound business practice. The shareholders would revolt. The board would be legally obligated to challenge it." "Perhaps," Emma acknowledged. "But from what grandmother said, she has the controlling interest to make this decision regardless of opposition. There are ways to challenge such transfers, especially when they might be influenced by diminished capacity." Richard's implication hung in the air between them. Emma felt a chill at what her father was suggesting. "You would claim your own mother is mentally incompetent to prevent this from happening?" "I would protect the company my father built from being dismantled based on ancient history and misplaced guilt," Richard replied, a hint of steel entering his voice. Emma looked across the room to where Eleanor and Judith sat in conversation, their postures relaxed despite the storm swirling around them. Then she looked back at her father, seeing him perhaps more clearly than she ever had before. "What if it isn't about guilt?" she asked quietly. "What if it's about justice? About finally doing what's right, even if it's decades overdue?" Richard's expression hardened. "Justice is a luxury businesses cannot always afford, Emma. The Morgan legacy includes theft and exploitation, Emma finished, and perhaps it's time that legacy was amended. Her father studied her for a long moment, reassessing her in light of this unexpected resistance. "I've always known you didn't share the family's priorities," he said finally, "but I never thought you would actively work against your own father's interests." The words were designed to wound, to activate the lifetime of seeking approval that had shaped Emma's relationship with her father. But something had shifted within her, a recalibration of what mattered, and whose approval she truly valued. "I'm not working against you," Emma said gently. "I'm considering standing for something my great-grandfather believed in. That prosperity without principle is ultimately worthless." Richard's face registered genuine surprise at this response. Before he could formulate a reply, Michael approached, his expression concerned. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, addressing Emma rather than their father. "Grandmother is asking for you. She says there's something else you need to see before you consider her offer." Richard stood abruptly. "This conversation isn't finished, Emma." As he strode away, Michael raised an eyebrow questioningly. "You okay?" Emma nodded slowly. "I think I might be, actually, for the first time in a very long time." Emma followed Michael across the room to where Eleanor and Judith waited, aware of the family's eyes tracking her movement. The atmosphere had shifted palpably. What had begun as shock and confusion was crystallizing into distinct factions. Richard had rejoined Victoria and Andrew near the doorway, their hushed conversation punctuated by concerned glances toward Eleanor. Abigail and her husband stood slightly apart, while other relatives seemed to be calculating where their interests might best be served in this family schism. "Sit, dear," Eleanor instructed as Emma approached, patting the ottoman beside her chair. "You've had quite a bit to absorb today." "That's an understatement," Emma replied, taking the offered seat. "I feel like I've walked into someone else's life." "Not someone else's," Judith corrected gently. "Just a more complete version of your own." Eleanor retrieved a small leather-bound book from the portfolio, a journal, its pages yellowed with age. This was Edward's personal diary from 1942, the year before his death. Rebecca preserved it and eventually passed it to her nephew, who shared it with me after Joseph died. She handed the journal to Emma, who accepted it with care, acutely aware of its age and significance. "Page 43, Eleanor directed. "The entry for October 17th, 1942. Emma carefully opened the fragile journal to the indicated page, where neat, precise handwriting filled the lined paper. October 17th, 1942. Jay made his final move today. Leveraged Wallace's anti-Semitism to turn the board against me. Offered a settlement amounting to 12 cents on the dollar for my stake. Generous under the circumstances, were his exact words. The circumstances being that no one will do business with a Jew whose loyalty has been questioned, however baselessly, during wartime. Rebecca urges me to fight, but to what end? Our legal options are limited, our resources dwindling. Jay has ensured that my reputation in financial circles is sullied beyond repair. The cruelest cut is that he was once my friend, a man I trusted with my ideas, my vision for a different kind of investment firm. My greatest regret is not for the money lost, but for the vision abandoned. Our plan to create a company that balanced profit with responsibility, that invested in sustainable enterprises when such thinking was dismissed as impractical, this was what truly mattered. Jay will surely dismantle these initiatives now. They were always my passion more than his. Perhaps someday, someone in the Morgan line will rediscover this purpose. I must believe that values, like certain genetic traits, can lie dormant for generations before reasserting themselves. Emma looked up from the journal, emotions constricting her throat. "He could have been describing my work," she said softly. "The balance between economic development and environmental protection. It's exactly what I've dedicated my career to." "Without ever knowing of your connection to him," Judith nodded. "Some inheritances transcend conscious knowledge, it seems." Eleanor retrieved an envelope from among the documents. "There's one more thing you should see, something I've kept private for over 60 years. From the envelope, she withdrew a black and white photograph, its edges worn from handling. It showed a much younger Eleanor with a dark-haired woman of similar age, both smiling at the camera, standing before what appeared to be a lakeside cabin. "Rebecca and I, summer of 1947, Eleanor explained. "We maintained our friendship in secret throughout our lives. This was taken at the Harrington family cabin in Vermont, a property that remains in the Harrington Trust." Emma studied the photograph, noting the genuine warmth between the women. "You really were friends, despite everything that happened. More than friends," Eleanor said quietly. Rebecca was the closest confidant I ever had. She understood the limitations of the life I'd chosen, just as I understood the hardships of hers. We supported each other through Joseph's increasing business success and her financial struggles, through my difficulties with Richard and her loneliness after Edward's death. The elderly woman's gaze grew distant with memory. When Rebecca learned she was expecting Edward's child, Judith, she was nearly destitute. Joseph's actions had left her widowed and impoverished. My offer to raise her child as my own was born both of her desperate circumstances and my own inability to have more children. Did you ever regret the deception? Emma asked. Only that it continued so long, Eleanor admitted. I had planned to tell Judith the truth when she turned 21, but by then, Joseph was at the height of his influence. The potential scandal could have damaged not just the company, but Judith standing within it. From across the room, Emma became aware of her father watching their conversation with increasing agitation. He whispered something to Victoria, who nodded and approached one of the cousins who worked as the company's public relations director. They're strategizing, Michael murmured, having taken a position slightly behind Emma. Dad's mobilizing the family loyalists. Eleanor followed Emma's gaze toward Richard's impromptu conference, her expression hardening. Your father believes he can outmaneuver me, she observed. He forgets who taught him to play chess. She turned back to Emma, her manner becoming more businesslike. You need to understand exactly what I'm proposing before Richard attempts to undermine it. The restructured Harrington Environmental Trust would control 30% of Morgan Investments, with 3 primary mandates. Eleanor counted these off on her aged fingers. First, to ensure the company adopts genuinely sustainable practices across all divisions. Second, to fund significant environmental restoration projects throughout New England, beginning with complete rehabilitation of the watershed regions Edward identified 80 years ago. And third, to establish an educational foundation promoting environmental leadership. The company would fight these changes at every turn, Emma observed. Initially, yes, Eleanor acknowledged, which is why the trust requires someone with both environmental expertise and the fortitude to withstand considerable pressure. Her gaze was direct, assessing. Someone like Edward Harrington's great-granddaughter. Before Emma could respond, the room's attention was captured by Richard's raised voice from across the room. This family discussion has gone on long enough, he announced, his tone carrying the authority of decades leading the Morgan enterprises. Mother is clearly fatigued, and these sensitive matters deserve careful consideration in a more appropriate setting. He moved toward Eleanor with the confident stride of someone accustomed to taking control of difficult situations. I've arranged for Dr. Winters to stop by this evening to check on you, Mother. In the meantime, I suggest we conclude our Thanksgiving gathering and allow everyone to process today's revelations. The implied questioning of Eleanor's competence was unmistakable. Emma glanced at her grandmother, expecting anger, but saw instead a composed determination that bordered on satisfaction, as though Richard were behaving exactly as she had anticipated. Before anyone leaves, Eleanor said, her voice carrying clearly despite its age-thinned quality, there's one final piece of information that should be shared. She looked directly at Richard. The paperwork transferring 30% of Morgan Investments to the restructured Harrington Trust was executed last week. It is not a proposal. It is accomplished fact. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only when Richard finally managed to speak, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. You had no right to make such a decision unilaterally. I had every right, Eleanor countered calmly. And unlike your father, I've chosen to correct a historic wrong while I'm still alive, to witness justice being done. As the implications of this announcement rippled through the room, Emma realized that the carefully maintained power structure of the Morgan family had not merely been challenged, it had been fundamentally and irrevocably altered. The Thanksgiving gathering had fractured into chaotic fragments. Richard had retreated to his father's study with Andrew and several cousins who held executive positions at Morgan Investments, presumably to assess their legal options. Victoria maintained a brittle semblance of holiday normalcy in the dining room, serving coffee to bewildered in-laws and extended family members. In the midst of this disintegration, Emma found herself in the conservatory with Michael, Judith, and surprisingly, Abigail. Eleanor had excused herself for a brief rest, extracting promises from both Emma and Judith to remain until her return. So you've actually been a Harrington all along, Michael said to Judith, still processing the revelations. That explains a few things. Judith raised an eyebrow. Such as? Your persistent failure to embrace the Morgan family philosophy of profit above all. Michael replied with a hint of his usual humor. Dad always said you were the least Morgan-like Morgan. A comment he intended as criticism, but I received as high praise, Judith acknowledged with a smile. Abigail, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. I keep thinking about Thanksgiving dinners growing up. How Aunt Judith was always seated near the corner, like Emma. How grandmother would sometimes watch you both with this strange expression. Not quite sad, not quite proud. She was seeing echoes of Edward, Judith confirmed. In me, and later, in Emma. It must have been both painful and vindicating. Emma had been leafing through Edward Harrington's journal, absorbing her great-grandfather's voice across decades. She looked up now, a question forming. What I don't understand is why grandmother chose today, this particular Thanksgiving, to reveal everything. Judith and Abigail exchanged glances, suggesting they shared information Emma didn't yet have. The timing isn't random, Judith acknowledged. There are business considerations at play beyond the historical injustice. Abigail nodded. Morgan Investments is finalizing a major acquisition next week, Westlake Development. It's a company that specializes in luxury housing developments in environmentally sensitive coastal areas. I'm familiar with Westlake, Emma said, frowning. Their projects have been environmental disasters, wetland destruction, habitat fragmentation, serious runoff issues affecting marine ecosystems. Exactly, Judith confirmed. The acquisition represents everything Edward Harrington opposed and everything Richard enthusiastically supports. Maximum profit with minimal environmental consideration. Michael leaned forward, understanding dawning. So grandmother's timing ensures the Harrington Trust will have voting power before the acquisition is finalized. The trust could block the Westlake deal, Emma realized, the implications becoming clear. That's why Dad is so panicked. It's not just about the family history, it's about an immediate 8-figure transaction. 9 figures, actually, Abigail corrected. I've seen the financial projections. The development potential alone is valued at over $300 million. The conservatory door opened, and Andrew entered, his expression grim. Whatever discussion had occurred in the study had clearly been intense. Dad sent me to find you, he said to Abigail. The family jet is being prepared. He wants all key personnel back in Boston tonight for an emergency board session tomorrow morning. Abigail didn't move, and if I choose not to go? Andrew blinked, clearly not expecting resistance from his typically compliant wife. This isn't optional, Abigail. The company is facing a crisis. The company is facing accountability, she countered quietly. Not quite the same thing. Emma watched this exchange with surprise. Abigail had always embodied the Morgan family values, or seemed to. This small act of defiance suggested complexities Emma had never recognized in her cousin. You can tell Richard I'll be staying through the weekend as planned, Abigail continued, her voice gaining confidence. The children are looking forward to our traditional Friday activities with their grandmother. Andrew's face registered confusion, then annoyance. Since when do you refer to my father as Richard? Since I'm reconsidering many aspects of my relationship with this family, Abigail replied evenly. The tension between husband and wife was palpable. After a moment, Andrew turned to Michael. Dad wants to see you too. Michael sighed dramatically. To deliver the loyalty test? Or to enlist me in whatever legal countermeasures he's planning? Just come to the study, Michael. When the brothers had departed, an uncomfortable silence settled over the conservatory. Abigail seemed suddenly conscious of having revealed more of her feelings than perhaps intended. I should check on the children, she said, rising from her seat. At the door, she paused, looking back at Emma. Whatever you decide about the trust, just know, not everyone in the family thinks like Richard. After Abigail left, Emma turned to Judith. What was that about? I've never seen Abigail stand up to Andrew or disagree with anything related to the company. Judith smiled slightly. People contain multitudes, Emma. Abigail joined the family at 23, fresh from business school and eager to please. She's 40 now, with her own developing perspective on the Morgan approach to business and family. And she's not the only one questioning the status quo, came Eleanor's voice from the doorway. The Morgan matriarch had returned, looking refreshed and determined. Several board members have privately expressed concerns about Richard's leadership in recent years. His focus on rapid expansion has come at the expense of corporate stability and ethical considerations. Eleanor moved to join them, lowering herself carefully into a wicker chair. The Westlake acquisition is merely the most egregious example of a pattern. Richard dismisses environmental regulations as bureaucratic obstacles to be circumvented, rather than legitimate protections of public resources. Just like Joseph did, Judith observed. Yes, Eleanor acknowledged. The sins of the father, perpetuated through generations. She focused on Emma, which is why your role is so crucial. You represent not just Edward's biological legacy, but his ethical one, the path not taken 80 years ago. Emma felt the weight of this responsibility settling onto her shoulders. It's a lot to ask of someone who just learned her family history over dessert. It is, Eleanor agreed without apology. But consider the alternative. Richard will fight the trust's establishment with every legal tool at his disposal. If he succeeds, Morgan Investments will continue its environmentally destructive practices unchecked, beginning with Westlake. From elsewhere in the house came the sounds of continued disruption, raised voices, doors closing firmly, the unmistakable sense of a family system in turmoil. They're mobilizing quickly, Judith observed. Richard won't waste any time challenging the transfer. Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. Which is why we must be equally decisive. She turned to Emma, her expression softening slightly. I've given you no time to process these revelations, and for that, I apologize. But circumstances require immediate action if Edward's legacy is to be preserved. Emma looked down at the journal in her lap, her great-grandfather's words speaking across time. Perhaps someday, someone in the Morgan line will rediscover this purpose. What exactly would accepting this role entail? She asked, looking up to meet her grandmother's steady gaze. Becoming the primary director of the Harrington Environmental Trust, Eleanor explained. Working with a board of environmental experts and ethical investment advisors to guide Morgan Investments toward sustainable practices. Using the trust's resources to fund meaningful conservation initiatives. And, she added with a hint of her characteristic directness, standing firm against considerable pressure from your father and others who will resist these changes. You're asking me to become the family adversary, Emma observed. I'm asking you to become the family's conscience, Eleanor corrected, a role that has been vacant for far too long. Before Emma could respond, the conservatory door opened again. This time, it was Richard who entered, his expression controlled, but his anger evident in the tightness around his eyes. Mother, he said coldly, your doctor has arrived to evaluate your condition. And Emma, he continued, turning to his daughter, we need to speak privately before you make any decisions you might regret. The implicit threat hung in the air between them, a family schism with no possibility of repair if Emma chose Edward's legacy over her father's wishes. The study had been Joseph Morgan's domain, then Richard's, maintaining the same essential character across decades. Dark wood paneling, leather-bound books selected more for appearance than content, and an imposing desk designed to establish the occupant's authority. Emma had rarely been invited into the sanctum of Morgan family power, and never for a conversation of consequence. Now she stood before the desk while Richard sat behind it, the physical positioning making their changing relationship painfully evident. No longer merely the disappointing daughter with impractical ideals, Emma had become a potential threat to everything Richard had spent his life building and protecting. Dr. Winters is examining grandmother, Emma said, breaking the tense silence. Though we both know there's nothing wrong with her mental capacity. Mother is 87 years old and has just made a financial decision that could devastate the company, Richard replied evenly. Seeking medical evaluation is prudent, not malicious. It's transparent, Dad. You're building a case to challenge her competency because you don't like her decisions. Richard leaned back in his chair, studying his daughter with new assessment in his gaze. You've always been intelligent, Emma. Idealistic to a fault, but intelligent. So let me speak to that intelligence rather than the emotion of the moment. He gestured to the chair opposite the desk, and after a moment's hesitation, Emma sat. Morgan Investments employs over 5,000 people directly, and our projects create jobs for thousands more, Richard began, his tone shifting to the persuasive cadence he used for important business presentations. The company's philanthropic foundation funds hospitals, scholarships, cultural institutions. Our investment strategies support pension funds that allow hardworking people to retire with dignity. He leaned forward, emphasizing his points with measured hand gestures. Yes, we prioritize growth and profitability. Yes, some of our development projects have environmental impacts, but the net positive effect of our business on communities far outweighs these considerations. That's a false dichotomy, Emma countered. Economic prosperity doesn't require environmental destruction. Sustainable development is possible, necessary even for long-term business viability. Richard's expression revealed a flicker of surprise at her articulate response. Perhaps in theory, but in competitive markets, Companies that voluntarily assume additional constraints lose ground to those that don't. It's basic business reality. It's short-term thinking, Emma replied. The businesses that will thrive in the coming decades are those adapting now to environmental imperatives. You sound exactly like him, Richard said quietly. Like who? Edward Harrington? Richard's mouth twisted slightly. Mother kept his journals in the family library. I found them as a teenager, read his high-minded theories about business ethics and environmental stewardship. Even then, I recognized them as impractical idealism. This revelation startled Emma. You knew about Edward? About what grandfather did to him? I knew there had been a founding partner who left early in the company's history, Richard clarified. The full circumstances were unclear. Mother never discussed it directly. But you suspected the truth, Emma pressed. You read his journals, saw his vision for the company. Richard's expression hardened. What I saw was the naive perspective of a man who failed while my father succeeded. Joseph Morgan built a business empire that has sustained generations of our family. Whatever occurred between him and Harrington is ancient history, irrelevant to current operations. It's not irrelevant if it was built on theft and exploitation, Emma said quietly. And it's not irrelevant if the company continues to prioritize profit over fundamental ethical considerations. Richard studied his daughter, reassessing her in light of this unexpected backbone. What exactly do you want, Emma? To punish the current company for actions taken 80 years ago? To impose your environmental ideology on a successful business model? To embarrass your family with public accusations about the past? I want justice, Emma replied simply. For Edward Harrington, yes, but also for the communities and ecosystems impacted by Morgan development projects. For the people who will suffer the consequences of environmental degradation long after the profit has been extracted. She leaned forward, meeting her father's gaze directly. And I want the Morgan legacy to be something more than wealth accumulated at others' expense. Something my children, your grandchildren, could be genuinely proud of. Richard's expression flickered at the mention of potential grandchildren, a subtle reminder of family continuity beyond immediate business concerns. And if pursuing this justice means destroying what I've spent my life building? He asked, his voice holding an edge of genuine pain beneath the anger. If it means public humiliation for the Morgan name? If it means permanently damaging your relationship with your father? The question hung between them, the crux of Emma's dilemma. Before she could respond, a knock at the study door interrupted their confrontation. Michael entered without waiting for permission, his expression uncharacteristically serious. You need to come quickly, he said to both of them. Grandmother has collapsed. The study emptied immediately, father and daughter momentarily united by concern as they hurried toward the main living room. They found Eleanor seated in her wingback chair, pale but conscious, while Dr. Winters checked her pulse and Victoria hovered anxiously nearby. Judith knelt beside her mother, holding her hand. It's nothing dramatic, Eleanor said as they entered, her voice weaker but still commanding. Just an old woman overdoing things on a stressful day. Dr. Winters, a distinguished man in his 60s who had been the family physician for decades, looked up with professional concern. Her blood pressure is elevated, and she's showing signs of exhaustion. I've recommended immediate rest and minimal stress. He directed this last comment pointedly toward Richard. Perhaps this illustrates my point about major financial decisions, Richard said quietly, though not quietly enough. Eleanor's gaze sharpened. If you're suggesting this episode supports questioning my competency, Richard, you'll find Dr. Winters unwilling to cooperate with that narrative. He's been fully briefed on the family situation and the reasons for today's disclosures. Dr. Winters nodded confirmation, his loyalty clearly lying with his longtime patient rather than her son's agenda. Nevertheless, the doctor continued, I am insisting on rest. No more family discussions today, regardless of their importance. Victoria stepped forward, assuming her role as household manager. We'll move you to your bedroom, Eleanor. Perhaps Emma could assist? The request seemed innocuous, but Emma recognized it as a strategic move to separate her from Judith and isolate her from further influence. Before she could respond, Eleanor spoke again. Before I rest, there's one matter that cannot wait. She turned to Emma, her gaze direct despite her weakened state. The trust documents require formal acceptance by the primary director within 24 hours of disclosure. Your decision cannot be delayed, even by my health concerns. All eyes turned to Emma, the pressure of immediate choice hanging heavy in the room. Accept a role she barely understood, permanently altering her relationship with her father and much of her family, or decline, allowing Richard to challenge the trust's establishment and continue the Morgan business approach unchecked. "You don't have to decide this moment," Richard said, his tone softening to one of paternal concern. "Not with Mother in this condition. Legal matters can wait until everyone has had time to consider options carefully." "Actually," Judith interjected, "the timing is specified in the trust documents. By design, to prevent exactly the kind of delay tactics and pressure you're attempting now, Richard." The tension in the room was palpable as Emma looked from her father's controlled expression to her grandmother's expectant one, caught between competing loyalties and the weight of a legacy she hadn't known was hers until hours ago. "I need a moment," she said finally, stepping back from the circle of family members. Just a moment to think clearly. As she moved toward the windows overlooking the darkened gardens, Emma felt the physical distance creating necessary space for clear thought. The corner seat at dinner, once a symbol of her marginalization, now seemed prophetic. She had always been positioned at the edge of the Morgan family because, in truth, she was only partially of it. Edward Harrington's journal weighed in her mind. His vision, his values, his hope that someday his legacy might resurface in future generations. She thought of her environmental work, the river restoration project unexpectedly funded by her own great-grandfather's trust. The symmetry seemed too perfect to be coincidence. When Emma turned back to face her waiting family, her decision was written in her posture, shoulders straight, chin lifted, a certainty in her expression that Richard immediately recognized, and Victoria instinctively feared. "I accept the position," Emma said clearly, addressing her grandmother directly. "I'll serve as director of the Harrington Environmental Trust." Richard's face hardened, while Eleanor's showed visible relief despite her exhaustion. The division in the room was immediate and palpable. Those who would stand with Emma's decision and those who would oppose it, battle lines drawn across generations of Morgan family dynamics. "Then it's done," Eleanor said softly, reaching for the pen Dr. Winters offered from his pocket. She signed the acceptance document Judith quickly produced, then held the pen out to Emma. "Edward would be proud, as am I." As Emma stepped forward to formalize her acceptance, she caught sight of Michael raising his water glass subtly in her direction, a private toast from the corner of the room, echoing Aunt Judith's public acknowledgement hours earlier. The simple gesture reminded Emma that even in families divided by conflict, unexpected alliances could form in the spaces between power centers. Sometimes, the most meaningful recognition came not from those who had always held power, but from those who had observed from the margins, waiting for the moment when change became possible. Night had fallen over the Morgan estate, the Thanksgiving gathering having disintegrated into tense fragments. Most extended family members had departed hastily, sensing the seismic shifts in family power dynamics and preferring to observe from a safe distance. Richard had sequestered himself in the study with Andrew and several cousins who held executive positions at Morgan Investments, strategizing their response to the day's revelations. Eleanor had been settled in her bedroom under Dr. Winters' supervision, with strict instructions to rest. Against Victoria's barely concealed objections, she had requested Judith remain with her, the two women continuing private conversations behind closed doors. Emma found herself in the kitchen with Michael and, surprisingly, Abigail, who had elected to stay, despite Andrew's clear displeasure. Harriet had prepared a tray of sandwiches, a practical acknowledgement that the formal Thanksgiving dinner had been thoroughly disrupted before anyone had properly eaten. "So you're officially the director of the Harrington Environmental Trust," Michael observed, passing Emma a cup of tea. "How does it feel to go from family outsider to controlling 30% of Morgan Investments in a single afternoon?" "Surreal," Emma admitted, "and terrifying. Dad is already mobilizing against me." "Against the trust," Abigail corrected, her typical Polish momentarily set aside as she made herself a sandwich. "It's an important distinction. This isn't personal, even though it feels that way." "It's absolutely personal," Michael disagreed. "Dad views this as betrayal, Mother's, Judith's, and now Emma's. The fact that it's also a legitimate business challenge makes it worse, not better." Emma studied her brother and cousin with new appreciation. Both had always seemed firmly embedded in the Morgan family system. Michael through his charm and ability to navigate between worlds. Abigail through her perfect performance of Morgan's spouse duties. Yet both were showing unexpected complexity in this crisis. "Why are you both still here?" she asked directly. "Michael, you've always managed to stay on Dad's good side regardless of your actual opinions. And Abigail, you've built your entire adult life around fitting into this family." Michael grinned, the expression containing more genuine emotion than his usual practiced charm. "Maybe I'm tired of performing the role of agreeable son while watching my sister be marginalized for actually standing for something." Abigail's response was more measured. And maybe I've spent 17 years suppressing my own values to maintain family harmony, only to realize that harmony built on suppression isn't worth preserving. The kitchen door swung open, revealing Victoria Morgan. She paused momentarily, clearly surprised to find this particular grouping of family members in hushed conversation. "Emma," she said, her social mask firmly in place despite the family crisis, "your father would like to speak with you. He's in the study." "We were just eating," Emma replied, indicating the sandwiches. "I'll find him when I'm finished." Victoria's eyebrows rose slightly at this small defiance. "He was quite insistent." "I'm sure he was," Emma acknowledged, "but I need a few minutes to gather my thoughts before another confrontation." Mother and daughter regarded each other across the kitchen, a lifetime of unbalanced power dynamics shifting visibly between them. Victoria had always been the enforcer of Morgan family expectations, the meticulous architect of social hierarchies that consistently positioned Emma at the margins. "This situation has gone far enough," Victoria said finally, her controlled facade cracking slightly. "Your grandmother's dramatic revelations and your impulsive decision have created a crisis that threatens everything this family has built. Your father is attempting to salvage what he can. The least you could do is listen to him." "I've been listening to Dad my entire life," Emma replied evenly. "I've listened as he dismissed my education choices, my career path, my values. I've listened as he explained why profit justifies environmental destruction, why family loyalty requires accepting practices I find ethically disturbing." She set down her teacup carefully. "What's different now is that he might need to listen to me for a change." Victoria stared at her daughter as though seeing her for the first time, not the disappointing youngest child who had never quite fit the Morgan mold, but a woman with unexpected backbone and newly discovered purpose. "You have no idea what you've set in motion," Victoria said finally, her voice lowered. "Richard won't accept this situation. He can't afford to, professionally or personally. That's his choice," Emma replied, "just as accepting the trust directorship was mine." Victoria's expression shifted, revealing something Emma had rarely seen directed toward her, genuine concern rather than disappointment. "There are aspects to this situation you don't understand, Emma. Family history that goes beyond what Judith and Mother have shared." Before Emma could question this cryptic statement, Richard appeared in the doorway behind Victoria, his expression grim. "Since you won't come to the study," he said to Emma, "we'll have this conversation here." He glanced at Michael and Abigail. Privately. Neither moved, their silent solidarity with Emma making their positions clear. Richard's jaw tightened at this further evidence of family fracturing. "Fine," he said tersely. "What I have to say can be witnessed." He focused on Emma, his businessman's facade unable to completely mask the emotional current beneath. "I've just spoken with our chief legal counsel. While the trust transfer appears legally executed, there are multiple grounds for challenge, beginning with questions about Mother's decision-making capacity. Dr. Winters has already made his opinion on that matter clear," Emma pointed out. "One doctor's assessment can be countered by others," Richard replied dismissively. "But that's merely one avenue of many. The more immediate issue is your formal acceptance of the director position." He placed a document on the kitchen counter, multiple pages of dense legal text. "This is a copy of the trust's governing document, which Mother conveniently failed to share before pressuring you into acceptance. Page 12, Section 4 outlines the director's fiduciary responsibilities." Emma picked up the document, scanning the indicated section as Richard continued. "As director, you are legally obligated to act in the best financial interests of the trust. Any actions that deliberately devalue Morgan investments, such as blocking profitable acquisitions like Westlake Development, could constitute breach of fiduciary duty." Emma looked up from the document, understanding the trap. "You're saying if I use the trust's voting power to prevent environmentally destructive projects, I could be sued for failing to maximize financial returns?" "Precisely," Richard confirmed, a hint of satisfaction in his tone. "Environmental considerations are secondary to financial obligations under trust law. You would face personal liability for any actions deemed contrary to the trust's financial interests." The revelation hung in the air, a sophisticated chess move that threatened to neutralize Emma's position before she could exercise any meaningful influence. "So this is your strategy," she said quietly. "Not to challenge the trust's existence, but to ensure it becomes just another profit-maximizing entity." Richard's expression remained impassive. "I'm simply pointing out the legal reality. Your acceptance was hasty and ill-informed. I'm offering you an opportunity to reconsider before tomorrow's emergency board meeting regarding the Westlake acquisition." The kitchen fell silent as Emma absorbed the implications of this legal constraint. Her father watched her carefully, clearly believing he had found the leverage needed to bring his wayward daughter back in line with family priorities. What Richard couldn't know was that during her hours in the corner seat at countless Morgan family gatherings, Emma had developed not just patience but strategic thinking of her own, observation skills that now allowed her to see beyond the immediate legal challenge to possibilities her father had perhaps overlooked. "I'll need to review this document thoroughly," she said finally, meeting her father's gaze with unexpected calm, preferably with independent legal counsel. Richard's expression revealed momentary surprise at this measured response, having expected either capitulation or emotional rebellion. "The board meeting is at 9 tomorrow morning. Your decision needs to be finalized before then." Emma nodded, gathering the document and rising from her seat. "Then I have work to do tonight." As she moved toward the door, she paused beside her father. "You taught me that in business, the person who appears to have lost the first round often has advantages others don't recognize," she said quietly. "It was one of your better lessons." The subtle challenge in her words was clear. This conflict was far from resolved, despite Richard's apparent legal advantage. As Emma left the kitchen, Michael's appreciative smile and Abigail's thoughtful nod suggested she had allies she might not have recognized before this extraordinary Thanksgiving had upended the Morgan family dynamics forever. Dawn broke over the Morgan estate, pale November light filtering through bare trees. Emma stood at the window of her childhood bedroom, watching the sunrise with the heightened awareness that comes from a night without sleep. Spread across the bed behind her were legal documents, Edward Harrington's journal, and notes from hours of phone consultations with attorneys recommended by Judith. A soft knock at the door preceded Michael's entrance, bearing 2 steaming mugs of coffee. "Thought you might need reinforcements," he said, offering one to Emma. "The family jets have been coming and going all night. Dad's assembled quite the war council for this morning's board meeting." "I know," Emma replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Judith's contacts at the company have been keeping us informed. Board members flying in from across the country, legal teams prepping in the downtown offices, PR specialists drafting statements for various scenarios. Quite the response to one woman accepting a trust directorship," Michael observed, settling into the window seat. "It's more than that, and you know it," Emma said. "This is about control of the company's future direction. About whether environmental and ethical considerations will finally have equal weight with profit motives." Michael studied his sister with newfound respect. "You know, for someone who's spent her life avoiding corporate politics, you've developed a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of power dynamics." "I've had a good vantage point from the corner seat," Emma replied with a tired smile. "You see things clearly when no one's paying attention to you." Their conversation was interrupted by another knock, Harriet announcing that cars would be leaving for the Boston offices in 30 minutes. The board meeting had been moved up to 8 o'clock, an obvious tactic to pressure Emma by reducing her preparation time. "Have you decided how you're handling the fiduciary duty issue?" Michael asked as Harriet departed. Emma nodded, gathering her documents into a portfolio Judith had provided, leather-bound with the Harrington family crest subtly embossed on the cover. "I have," she confirmed, "but I'd rather not share details just yet. The fewer people who know the strategy, the better." Michael accepted this with a nod. "Fair enough. Will you ride in with me? Dad's already left with Andrew and the legal team. Actually, Judith's arranged transportation for us. She and grandmother insist on attending, despite Dad's objections." Downstairs, they found Eleanor Morgan seated in the foyer, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit that emphasized her status as company matriarch rather than elderly invalid. Judith stood beside her, similarly formal in her attire, while Victoria supervised the loading of Richard's forgotten briefcase into a waiting car. "Emma," Eleanor acknowledged, her voice stronger than the previous evening. "Are you prepared?" "As much as possible on 12 hours' notice," Emma replied. Eleanor nodded approvingly. Sometimes the most consequential battles must be fought with minimal preparation. Joseph understood this during the war years. It was one of his few genuine talents, adapting strategy under pressure. Victoria approached, her expression revealing the strain of divided loyalties between husband and mother-in-law. "Richard expects this situation to be resolved at today's meeting," she said, addressing no one in particular. "He believes the board will recognize the legal and practical impossibilities of what you're proposing. Richard has always excelled at convincing himself that what is convenient for Morgan Investments must be objectively correct," Eleanor observed dryly. "A family trait I'm pleased to see diminishing in subsequent generations." The drive to Boston occurred in strategic silence, each occupant of the car mentally preparing for the confrontation ahead. Emma watched the familiar landscape pass, the affluent suburbs giving way to the denser urban environment, trees and spacious properties replaced by steel and glass monuments to commerce and finance. The Morgan Investments headquarters dominated its corner of the financial district. 38 stories of statement architecture commissioned during Richard's early leadership, designed to project power and unshakable confidence. As their car pulled into the reserved parking area, Emma noted the unusually high security presence and the cluster of journalists being held at a discreet distance from the main entrance. "Word has leaked about a major company development," Judith observed, following Emma's gaze toward the media contingent. "Richard's likely planning a statement after the board meeting, assuming it goes his way." In the executive elevator, rising toward the top-floor boardroom, Emma felt a momentary vertigo that had nothing to do with the rapid ascent. In a matter of hours, she had gone from marginal family member to central figure in a corporate power struggle with environmental implications far beyond the Morgan family dynamics. "Remember who you're fighting for?" Eleanor said quietly, as though reading her thoughts. "Not just yourself, not just Edward's legacy, but everyone affected by how this company conducts itself in the world." The elevator doors opened directly into the reception area outside the boardroom, revealing a scene of controlled corporate intensity. Executives in formal business attire conferred in small groups. Legal advisors reviewed documents. And at the center of it all, Richard Morgan stood with the company's chief counsel, deep in conversation. He looked up as they entered, his expression momentarily revealing surprise at Eleanor's presence before hardening into professional determination. Around the reception area, conversations paused as attention shifted to the new arrivals, particularly to Emma, whose role in the unfolding situation had clearly become the subject of intense speculation. "Mother," Richard acknowledged stiffly. "The doctor advised against this excursion. The doctor advised against stress, not against fulfilling my responsibilities as majority shareholder," Eleanor corrected. "Shall we proceed? I believe you've scheduled an early meeting to minimize preparation time for certain parties." Without waiting for response, she moved toward the boardroom doors, which were opened immediately by attending staff. The Morgan Investments Board of Directors was already assembled around the massive table, 16 people representing major shareholders, industry experts, and company executives. At the head of the table, Richard's chair remained empty, a position of authority he had occupied for nearly 20 years. As they entered, Emma noted the carefully arranged seating, placards positioned to separate her from Judith and Eleanor, surrounding her instead with Richard's strongest allies on the board. A small but telling attempt to isolate her during the coming discussion. In a decision that seemed both spontaneous and deeply symbolic, Emma deliberately removed her nameplate from its assigned position and placed it at the opposite end of the table from Richard's chair. The subtle power move, claiming equal visual status in the room's geography, caused a ripple of reactions around the table, from raised eyebrows to suppressed smiles. "I believe we're ready to begin," Richard announced, taking his seat and signaling for the doors to be closed. "We have one item on today's agenda, addressing the proposed transfer of 30% of company shares to the restructured Harrington Environmental Trust, and specifically, the implications for the pending Westlake Development acquisition." He focused his attention on Emma, seated directly opposite him at the table's far end. "Before we proceed, I understand you've had opportunity to review the trust's governing documents, particularly regarding fiduciary responsibilities. Have you reconsidered your position on accepting the directorship?" All eyes turned to Emma, the moment of confrontation having arrived. She opened the Harrington portfolio deliberately, removing a single document before meeting her father's gaze directly. "I have indeed reviewed the documents carefully," she confirmed, her voice steadier than she had anticipated. "And far from reconsidering, I've identified provisions that significantly strengthen the trust's position regarding environmental considerations." Richard's expression revealed momentary confusion, clearly not the response he had expected. "Page 17, Section 8 of the trust document," Emma continued, sliding copies toward board members on either side of her. "The purpose clause specifically defines best interests of the trust to include the advancement of environmental sustainability and ecological integrity as core value metrics alongside traditional financial returns." The board members began reviewing the indicated section as Emma continued. "Furthermore, the trust is explicitly established as a benefit entity under Massachusetts law, legally empowered to consider social and environmental impacts as equal to financial returns in all decision-making." Richard conferred hurriedly with his legal counsel, whose surprised expression confirmed what Emma already knew. They had focused so intently on standard fiduciary requirements that they had overlooked Eleanor's careful crafting of the trust's purpose provisions. These provisions are highly unusual, the chief counsel acknowledged reluctantly. They do appear to modify traditional fiduciary standards in ways that would permit consideration of environmental factors in voting decisions. The momentum in the room had shifted perceptibly. Board members exchanged glances, recalculating positions based on this new information. Even accepting these unorthodox provisions, Richard continued, regaining his composure, the practical reality remains unchanged. The Westlake acquisition represents significant financial opportunity for all shareholders. Blocking it would be contrary to sound business judgment. That depends entirely on how one defines sound business judgment, Emma replied, removing additional documents from her portfolio. Which brings me to the second component of my position as trust director. She distributed a bound report to each board member. This is an independent environmental and financial analysis of the Westlake properties, conducted by the Harrington Environmental Trust over the past 6 months. Richard's expression shifted from confusion to anger. What are you talking about? The trust was only restructured recently. The original Harrington Trust has existed continuously since 1943, Emma corrected. While its resources were modest compared to Morgan Investments, it maintained research capabilities focused on environmental assessment. Eleanor and Judith commissioned this analysis when the Westlake acquisition was first proposed internally. Board members were already reviewing the report's executive summary, which was highlighted for emphasis. The analysis identifies critical environmental vulnerabilities in all primary Westlake properties, Emma explained. Coastal erosion accelerating due to climate change, wetland deterioration affecting flood control capacity, and endangered species habitat in 3 key development areas. She paused, allowing this information to register before delivering the crucial point. More significantly, the report projects that these environmental factors will create material financial liabilities within 7 to 10 years. Litigation costs, regulatory penalties, and necessary remediation expenditures that would eliminate projected profits and potentially create significant losses. The boardroom had gone completely still, the only sound the turning of report pages as directors absorbed the detailed projections. In other words, Emma concluded, opposing the Westlake acquisition isn't contrary to fiduciary duty, it's essential to fulfilling it. The trust isn't asking the board to prioritize environment over profit. We're demonstrating that ignoring environmental factors fundamentally misrepresents the actual financial prospects of this acquisition. She met her father's gaze directly across the length of the boardroom table. The corner seat gives you an excellent vantage point, Dad. You see things others miss when they're focused only on what's directly in front of them. The reference to her traditional position at family gatherings wasn't lost on Richard, whose expression reflected the recognition that his daughter had outmaneuvered him using perspectives gained precisely because of her marginalized position in the family. As board members began questioning the company's due diligence process and whether environmental factors had been adequately considered in the acquisition analysis, Eleanor Morgan raised her glass of water, catching Emma's eye across the tumult of the boardroom. The gesture, subtle but unmistakable, a toast from the family matriarch to her granddaughter, completed the symmetry that had begun at Thanksgiving dinner. From the corner to the head of the table, from overlooked to instrumental, Emma had transformed her position through the very values the Morgan family had long dismissed as impractical idealism. And in that moment of silent acknowledgement between generations, both women recognized that the company bearing their name would never be quite the same again. 6 months later, the Morgan family gathered again, though in dramatically different configuration and circumstance. The lakeside property in Vermont, once Rebecca Harrington's summer cabin, now expanded into a comfortable retreat, hosted a very different kind of family celebration than the formal Thanksgiving that had upended generations of carefully maintained power dynamics. On the spacious deck overlooking still waters, Eleanor Morgan sat in a comfortable chair, observing with evident satisfaction as family members moved between conversation clusters, drinks in hand, the traditional hierarchies noticeably absent. Judith organized a buffet of casual foods with Harriet, who had chosen to retire from the main estate, but still occasionally assisted at family gatherings. Emma stood at the dock's edge with Michael and Abigail, discussing the latest developments in the company's environmental initiatives. The past months had brought significant changes to Morgan Investments, some painful, others promising, all necessary according to Eleanor's assessment. The Westlake acquisition had been abandoned after the board's vote against it, triggering a temporary but substantial drop in stock value and intense scrutiny from business media. Richard had fought the decision through multiple channels, but ultimately failed to override the combined influence of Eleanor's controlling shares and the Harrington Trust's 30% voting bloc. The corporate restructuring that followed had been extensive. Richard remained CEO, but with diminished authority, as a newly established sustainability committee, chaired by Emma as Harrington Trust Director, gained veto power over environmentally significant decisions. Several board members had resigned in protest. Others had embraced the new direction with surprising enthusiasm once the financial wisdom of avoiding environmentally problematic investments became apparent. The family restructuring had been equally profound. Richard and Victoria maintained minimal contact with Eleanor, Judith, and Emma, attending required company functions, but otherwise creating distance from what Richard termed the hostile takeover of Morgan family values. Andrew had aligned with his father professionally, though his marriage to Abigail had become increasingly strained as she demonstrated growing independence from Morgan family expectations. "Your grandmother's looking tired," Michael observed, glancing toward Eleanor on the deck. "This whole revolution she's engineered has taken a toll." Emma nodded, watching the elderly matriarch with concern. "Dr. Winters says her heart condition is stable, but requires careful management. She's determined to see the company transformation firmly established before—" She didn't complete the thought, though all three understood the reality of Eleanor's age and health. "She's accomplished more in 6 months than most people manage in a lifetime," Abigail observed. "The Morgan Harrington Historical Reconciliation Project alone would be a significant legacy." This initiative, publicly acknowledging Edward Harrington's role in founding the company and the circumstances of his removal, had generated considerable media attention. Rather than damaging the company's reputation as Richard had feared, the transparent addressing of historical wrongs had been generally received as corporate responsibility in action, particularly when coupled with the establishment of a business ethics center bearing both the Morgan and Harrington names. Their conversation paused as a car approached on the gravel driveway, a taxi delivering the final expected guest. Emma excused herself from the dock gathering and moved toward the cabin's front entrance, arriving just as Judith welcomed the newcomer. "Emma," Judith said, genuine pleasure in her voice, "I'd like you to meet Daniel Harrington, Edward's grandnephew and the trustee who managed the original Harrington Environmental Trust all these years." The distinguished man in his 70s extended his hand with a warm smile. "Finally, we meet in person. Your river restoration work impressed me even before I knew of our family connection." Emma accepted his handshake, studying his face for echoes of Edward Harrington's features from the photographs she'd seen. "Thank you for coming. Grandmother was particularly hoping you'd join us today." "I wouldn't have missed it," Daniel replied. "The foundation stone for the Edward Harrington Environmental Research Center is a historic moment, the fulfillment of my great-uncle's vision in ways he couldn't have imagined." They moved toward the deck, where Eleanor straightened in her chair at Daniel's approach, genuine emotion crossing her usually composed features. "You look just like him," she said softly as he took her offered hand, the same expression around the eyes. The gathered family members observed this meeting with various reactions, some moved by the historical significance, others simply enjoying the informal celebration that had replaced the rigid Morgan family gatherings of the past. As evening approached, Eleanor requested everyone's attention, rising from her chair with Judith's assistance. She lifted her glass, her gaze finding Emma among the family clusters. "A toast," she announced, her voice carrying across the deck despite its age-thinned quality. "To Emma, whose corner seat perspective helped us all see what we had been missing. And to Edward and Rebecca, whose legacy has finally found its rightful place in our family story." As glasses were raised around the deck, even by those still adjusting to the new family reality, Emma felt the weight of multiple generations' hopes and efforts resting on her shoulders. Not as burden, but as foundation, supporting the work that would continue long after this moment had passed into family history. The sunset gilded the lake water with transcendent light, nature offering its own acknowledgement of promises kept and possibilities renewed. From her new position, no longer at the corner but at the center of a transformed family system, Emma raised her glass in return, accepting both the recognition and the responsibility it represented. In that moment of connection across generations, the Morgan Harrington legacy found its equilibrium at last, not in wealth accumulated regardless of cost, but in balance restored between prosperity and principle, between human enterprise and the natural world that sustains it. As our story. At Thanksgiving dinner, they seated me at the corner. Then my aunt raised her glass to me first. Comes to a close. I invite you to reflect on the themes we've explored together in this journey of family dynamics, hidden histories, and environmental stewardship. Like Emma, many of us have experienced being positioned at the margins of family gatherings or professional settings, only to discover that this perspective offers unique insights others may miss. The corner seat, while sometimes lonely, provides a vantage point that can ultimately transform systems that need change. This story also reminds us that family histories are rarely as simple as the official narratives suggest. What secrets might your own family history contain? What unacknowledged contributions or hidden injustices might be waiting for recognition across generations? Perhaps most importantly, the Morgan-Harrington reconciliation demonstrates how confronting difficult truths, while initially painful, can ultimately lead to healing and more authentic connections. Sometimes the most meaningful toast comes from unexpected quarters, recognition that arrives precisely when we need it most. If this story resonated with you, I encourage you to consider your own position within the systems you navigate daily. Are you using your unique perspective, whether central or peripheral, to advocate for meaningful change? Are there environmental or social justice issues where your voice and influence could make a difference? Subscribe for more stories that explore the complex territories of family dynamics, environmental responsibility, and the courage required to stand for what matters, even when it disrupts comfortable patterns of power and privilege. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most powerful position isn't at the head of the table, but at the corner, where you can see everything, including the path forward that others might miss.